in Georgia, you have Renza Brusi. Well, Renza Brusi got, I think, released in 1956. And I don't know when the last time they did a seed, a foundation seed increase of that. But you look at those, there is from the earliest, plants to the latest plant, that's almost a 10-day window of maturity and heading date at least. Okay, you look at the hybrids, that's cut at least in half.
Welcome to the Crop Science Podcast Show by Wisenetics. I'm your host, Leo Bastos, professor in integrative precision agriculture at the University of Georgia. Today, we welcome our guest, Dr. Jochum Wiersma. He is the small grain specialist at the University of Minnesota. Jochum, welcome to the Crop Science Podcast Show. It's great to have you here today. And as we always do, I want to start off asking for you to share your path with us. Where did you start, and how what was your path until you got to where you are today?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation and for allowing me to be here. Well, with a name like this, obviously I didn't grow up in the U.S. I grew up actually up on a mixed farm, dairy and crops in the northern part of the Netherlands, just off the coast, in an area that the province basically is Friesland. Then went to the one ag university in the Netherlands after, and basically a neighbor encouraged me, you can always come back to the farm, get an education. And so that one university, of course, is Wageningen. The rest of the world pronounces it differently, but and then I did an internship at CIMMYT as part of my degree in plant breeding and genetics in Mexico City. And ended up talking with a lot of American postdocs and decided to pursue my PhD in genetics and plant breeding at the University of Minnesota. Came here in 91 off the boat, finished my PhD in 1995. And my advisor was the chair of the search committee at the time for the position I still hold. I never thought I was going to be an extension specialist. But here I am, almost 30 years later, and thoroughly enjoying the extension role.
Nice. Thanks for sharing that. And I guess just to complement this a little bit, can you perhaps talk a little bit about some of the projects that you are working on currently?
So, the focus really of the program, it's 60% or it's 80% extension, 20% research. I collaborate very closely with the breeding programs, and that actually, work-wise, is probably the biggest load. My project runs a lot of the yield trials for the breeding programs in wheat and barley and oats. I do variety testing for the winter cereals, winter rye, winter wheat, winter triticale now. On the agronomic side, as far as research, it's focused historically more on inputs, so get classical genotype by management by environment kind of studies. That included in the beginning seeding rates. It has included growth regulators. It had included fungicides. Now I'm more working on winter rye in the last couple of years, and there, because hybrid winter rye in a way is a new commodity or a new crop to the U.S. With very little research done up to this point, it's all the classic questions like, okay, what is the seeding rate? What's the optimum planting date for this, the northern plains? With that, okay, what herbicides are, because there's very few herbicides labeled, what additional herbicides should we look for labeling? Growth regulators. Can we shorten the crop even more than the hybrids already are compared to the traditional 40-year-old open-pollinated varieties? There is fungicide questions because Fusarium, rye, as any other of the small grains, is susceptible to Fusarium head blight, and we do have to worry about ergot. And both ergot and Fusarium head blight would be a big deterrent in the market. Not necessarily in the distilling market, but first and foremost in the feed market because it has a very good place in swine nutrition. A lot of the European countries, Germany, Denmark, have a substantial portion of their feed rations being rye. But you have to make sure, and swine are very sensitive to both ergot and fusarium head blight. So, can we manage that with fungicides to the point where it's safe for the swine to eat? So, that kind of are some of the projects that are ongoing right now.
Perfect. Something that I always ask our guests is for them to provide some context to our audience as far as the importance of whatever crop or technology they're working with in their estate. So along those lines, could you share with us, some thoughts around what is the economic importance of rye in Minnesota and perhaps some of its uses as well? I know you mentioned a few of them or a couple of them, but if you can just go a little bit deeper on that.
Even though Minnesota officially is not an I state, during this 30 years in my career, corn and soybeans have moved further north. Historically, they were southern men. And so, in a way, I've become, as a small grain specialist, almost a minor crop specialist. There's still 1.25 million acres of wheat in Minnesota, but barley acreage, for instance, dwindled from a peak of 750,000 acres to less than 100,000 in recent years, actually less than 60,000 acres. And the reason for it is corn and beans have taken over all the way up to the Canadian border. And so if you look at the larger umbrella under which I work in both the spring cereals and the winter cereal, it's about crop diversification. It is about cropping systems and the problems that you eventually create in a corn soybean system or a continuous corn system. And we've noticed that Minnesota has always been this transitional region between spring cereals only to the north of us in the Canadian provinces. And once you get to the Iowa border, it very quickly, Nebraska, that's all winter cereals. Minnesota is that transition zone. And in the last probably 10 years, we can clearly see that it's getting harder, and we have some data that for instance, for barley and oats, that transition is already happening where it's harder to raise them profitably, and we see yield declines because of climate change. Wheat, we don't see it yet, by the same token, the winters are getting milder, so it's easier for winter wheat now to survive Minnesota. And the question on the rye really came out of, can we raise rye in Minnesota? Because rye had pretty much disappeared out of the cover crop industry. I had one of the major seed dealers inquire with me, and he goes like, everybody wants rye for cover crop. Which one should I contract to get raised for seed? Somebody has to produce the seed. And that led me about 9 years ago, 10 years ago now, to say, okay, I know the Europeans have hybrid rye. What does that look like in Minnesota? And we found very quickly that A, they survive Minnesota, and B, they out yield open pollinated varieties by about 30 to 40%. So all of a sudden, we're looking at a potential, what I would call potential candidate to become a commodity and have larger acreage across the landscape. And then you can really start talking about landscape changes. As many of the audience might know, the University of Minnesota really is vested in winter and perennial crops in the Forever Green initiative. And to me, the winter annuals right now make the most sense. And so I'm hoping and I'm working towards getting more winter rye actually across the landscape.
Fantastic. So that's a really interesting point, and I wanted to follow up with you on that specific point of the hybrid rye, right? So you mentioned about some of the benefits here as far as yield, but can you expand a little bit more on the hybrid rye sense of how does it compare in other traits, right? So you're saying you're doing a lot of research around hybrid rye as far as planting date, perhaps the management of maybe soil fertility, perhaps other biotic stresses. Can you comment on that and how it compares to some of the more traditional open pollinated varieties?
The largest difference is that they're more uniform than the traditional open pollinated varieties. So the breeders do a little bit of inbreeding. It's not as uniform as a hybrid corn field looks like, but it is more uniform compared to the open pollinated varieties. Like if in Georgia you have Renza Bruzi. Well, Renza Bruzi got, I think, released in 1956. And I don't know when the last time they did a foundation seed increase of that. But you look at those, there is from the earliest, plants to the latest plant, that's almost a 10-day window of maturity and heading date at least. Okay. You look at the hybrids, that's cut at least in half. So more uniform, a little bit shorter, better straw strength. Disease wise, I don't have a good feel yet that they're substantially better than any of the open pollinated varieties. Rye is generally pretty tolerant or resistant to the diseases. I don't have enough good data to say that all the hybrids are better for ergot compared to some of the OPs. Because they're more uniform, they tend to set seed better, and that's the fastest way to reduce ergot incidence. Because ergot only has a chance if fertilization doesn't occur. And so there we're still finding our way to discover what all hybrid rye has to offer for the upper Midwest. But right now, it's head and shoulders above any of the OPs in all the ag ways you can manage this crop.
It's very impressive. Is that something that growers are already seeing and wanting to try for themselves and really taking on this new technology? How's
Yeah.
that going?
So one of the major buyers in the U.S. is an elevator in Indiana that works very closely with all the distillers in Kentucky. You can't have bourbon without rye. And historically, or at least in recent memory, they've always imported most of that rye out of Canada. Right now in Minnesota, in one county, it's now 2, 3 counties, we're to the point where the growers have organized themselves enough that a unit train of rye leaves that area to go straight to Kentucky. And so acreage is expanding, but 1 million acres of rye would be a god awful amount of whiskey. And so to really change landscapes, it needs to have a feed market. And in very early conversations with both Saatenunion and KWS, I stressed the point that, I know what you did in Germany and in Denmark with hybrid rye and swine nutrition. You have to do the same thing here. And all that work is either ongoing or has been done. One of the earliest studies was a PhD project at the Ohio State University, and feed equivalency is well established. And so we're in this kind of in between period right now, where it's a kind of a chicken and egg problem for feed mills. Feed mills are thin. It's like elevators. They have very thin margins, and switching over things cost money. And they have to have ample supply to be able to afford, switching. And that's where there's not enough acres yet. There's not a good way aggregation happens yet. So there's some marketing challenge. The agronomic challenges, I think, are relatively limited compared to for hybrid rye to be a success, compared to now the next step, which is the aggregation and the processing.
It's a really interesting point because a lot of times here we're talking more about the challenges on the agricultural side of things or the agronomy side of things, and this is a great example where that groundwork has already been done to a large extent, and now the main bottleneck is not that anymore. It's more the uptake of that up the chain. So it's a interesting.
And that to me, and in the fact that we solved some of those, and that we can borrow, and we can't borrow all the things that they did in Europe, but a lot of the things we can extrapolate, and we have to validate some of that work, and we're doing that. But it's in a way a ready to go crop compared to some of the other enterprises at the University of Minnesota, like Kernza. It I learned a very valuable lesson very early on as a kid growing up when our neighbor decided to start growing 20 hectares of broccoli. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with broccoli as a home gardener or on an industrial scale, but 20 hectares of broccoli is an awful lot of broccoli. Especially since you have to cut it every single morning at 5 and have to get it to market by 6, or start at 4 and have it to market at 6. He single-handedly was able to kill the broccoli market in the Netherlands simply because he overwhelmed the supply. And so for small commodities like current, small crops, like not small in the sense of small grain, but Kernza right now, I know growers that are sitting on a year's worth of production because there is no market. And that's unfortunate, but that hampers diversification of cropping systems. And so to me, that's why I think a crop like hybrid rye, which, and I always talk about it, it has to be a commodity. And people think of that as a dirty word, and it isn't. It just means that supply and demand can meet each other, and that you have transparency in the market, you have enough fluidity in the market that people can make choices.
Absolutely. And I do want to follow up on something you mentioned as far as a couple of things you said. I want to ask if you could elaborate a little bit more to our audience. So one of them was the Forever Green Initiative, and the second one was Kernza. To my understanding, I think they can be connected, but just want to make that clear for our audience as well, if you can expand on that.
So the University of Minnesota has a very in the agronomy department, and it stretches beyond its multiple departments. It has a large initiative called the Forever Green Initiative, and the goal truly is to have a living cover on the landscape 12 months out of the year. And so, if you have your summer annuals, that means you either add a winter annual in that system, or you convert some of those acres to perennials. And that goal really is, provide ecosystem services, reduce leaching, wind and water erosion, all those things that we don't want to leave a single field. And there's a bunch of breeding efforts into a couple of the crops occurrence. There's silphium, there is perennial flax. There's a whole bunch of crops that people are dabbling in and trying to not just develop the crop, but then also develop the markets for it. Kernza is intermediate wheatgrass. Is basically the species. The Land Institute in Kansas has worked on it for years, and they shared some of that germplasm with not only the University of Minnesota. There's a couple others that have access to it, and it's basically a full-fledged breeding program. And we're probably now in the third cycle of breeding, and it's starting to look like a crop versus just a forage, because that's what it is too. And seed size has increased, non-shattering, hullless types, all those things that make it more suitable to become a grain in the food industry.
Absolutely, and just to expand a little bit on Kernza specifically. So that would be basically a variety, perhaps, of wheat that instead of being an annual crop is more grown as a perennial crop. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it is a perennial as a forage, as a grain crop, and I am not involved in the Kernza at all. It's not considered a small grain, even though yeah, you should probably for my job at least. Um, it is right now one of the biggest challenges, and Jake Younger is the person that really does a lot of this research in our department. Is that there is a decline in yield after the second year. That's the biggest challenge for right now to keep kerns on the landscape longer than 2 growing seasons. So you have your establishment year, you have your first year harvest, your second year grain harvest, and after that, right now, it's hard to keep that stand and have it be productive.
I see. Yeah, I think that's a good. It's an important point for us to just quickly talk about, just to give some of the context of what Kernza is, especially for those of the audience that perhaps are not in the U.S. That may have not heard of this as much. I did part of my education in Kansas, and I attended some of the Land Institute events around all their programs, including Kernza. So it was a really interesting initiative. All right, so I have many questions here that I'm thinking, and I'm trying to choose the one to end at least our technical side of things. But so one of the things that we're saying is that on the technical side, growing hybrid rye is the bottleneck is not there. However, if I am a grower in Minnesota and I'm trying, and I want to try that option, I want to try to go for hybrid rye. What would be some of the main differences in the system, perhaps even on management, that a grower would have to consider when making the switch between open-pollinated and hybrid rye?
So the biggest switch that you have to make is not necessarily technical, but the choice of where you put it. Rye it is the darling of the cover crop industry because it pretty much is bulletproof, meaning that it doesn't need a lot of water to get established. It's a pretty good scavenger of nutrients. And so historically, you would put it on ground that you couldn't do anything else with. The sandiest of your sandboxes, the worst fields on your farm would be relegated to rye, because at least you had some chance of getting a crop. Obviously, if you're talking about 120 bushels per acre, it can't pull that out of thin air. So you have to have well-drained soils, but they have to have water holding capacity. Otherwise, if it drought stressed rye, even though it's more drought tolerant, it still needs water to produce those kinds of bushels. Likewise, nutrients, you are going to have to put inputs into it to be able to get to that kind of level of productivity. And so that's the switch you have to make as a producer. The first and foremost is don't expect 120 bushels if you have a field where you only ever produce 30 bushels of rye on an OP. Because you probably don't have any, water holding capacity. You probably never put enough fertility down, and that's apart from the cost of the seed, because it is a hybrid seed, and so there is a premium to the seed. That mindset that you actually have to provide inputs to make it successful is the biggest step I think people have to make.
Absolutely, yeah. Understanding that trade-off, right? It's not magic. It's actually biology and physics and other disciplines going on at the same time to make it happen. So, yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, I think with that, we wrap up our technical side of our episode. I want to ask our audience, if you're enjoying this episode, this great conversation with Dr. Jochum, please like this episode, subscribe, and share this with other people that you think may also benefit from this conversation.
It's time for our famous 3. Explore the future of agriculture with KWS, a global leader in innovation and sustainable farming practices. Uncover the exceptional qualities of our hybrid rye, cultivating a legacy for a greener tomorrow. Visit kws.com/US for more information and for dealer locations. KWS, seeding the future since 1856.
All right, so now I want to switch gears a little bit here and get into our final three questions. So these are more on the personal side and just more, asking for some references, some resources that you think that you came across and that you think may be helpful to share with our audience. The first one here is going to be anything related on the technical side, right? So the agriculture, on the agronomy, crop and soils, on the rye side. If you have anything that you came across and you think would be a great resource to share.
Because rye is, and especially hybrid rye, is in a way a completely new commodity. I keep calling it commodity, but as a crop, we actually have very few resources at this point in time. So there's not one I can really point to and go like, yeah, this is your hybrid rye Bible, run with it. I don't. The best advice I can give you is give me a call. I'm seriously, and there's others in neighboring states that, the seeding rate research actually was a collaborative effort with Ohio State, Wisconsin, and Kentucky. And the grad student was actually at Ohio State, and she's finishing up right now. And so we can share those results with you. But it's not wrapped nicely in a nice extension publication with a little bow on it right now.
Still in the process.
In the process.
Perfect. And just to follow up on that, so our audience, everyone that we interview here are professors that work at universities, or at least the ones I've interviewed up until this point are all professors in universities. You can easily find their contact if you just do a quick search online. You have their names, last names, and university affiliations. If you just do a quick search, you can find their contacts. So Dr. Jochum here is gracefully offering his own time and resources if you're interested in this. So they have that great resource. All right. So the second question here is pretty much the same question, but outside of the technical side of things. So more, perhaps on the personal side, on the interpersonal side of things as well. Any other resource that you came across that you think would be useful to share outside of the agronomy?
So I've had the opportunity to do leadership training, and a lot of universities have tracks internally, but especially in extension, we have a couple of programs to develop leadership. For me, this started already in graduate school. I bucked the system a little bit in grad school. I said, I want to take some management classes. And one of the committee members goes, no, you should take another stats class. And I love stats, don't get me wrong, but the likelihood, A, that you're going to end up in academia, and I really ended up by happenstance more than anything, and that you are not going to have managerial responsibilities is small. And so broaden your horizon, take those opportunities to develop your leadership skills. Most in academia, and I'm not the exception, are ISTJs in Myers-Briggs. And you go like, why are you an extension? Well, you practice something long enough, you can come across as an extrovert. Okay? But understand who you are and why other people do the things they do. Because that allows you to avoid conflicts and resolve conflict. The greatest exercise I ever did in one of these leadership trainings was how apt individuals are to change. And it really ties to their personalities. And at the end of the exercise, this whole group had spread out basically under a normal distribution, where some people were very much in favor of change and change everything for the sake of change. And the other side of the normal distribution was, we're not going to change. You can't make me change. And one of the persons on one side of the distribution goes, see, that's why never anything gets done. And the other side of the distribution said, yes, and we're the one that keep you out of prison. And doing that exercise and understanding that people are different, even within a department, but certainly once you get out of academia, allows you to be more effective in leadership. Because you do have, if you're in, it doesn't matter, you're going to have leadership responsibilities. And that to me is something you have to, you can train it just like stats.
Absolutely, and I love that example. I had a chance of doing one of these personality assessment trainings with a group of people, and I was also up until that point. I thought, we're all different, but for the most part, we agree in most things, and all of these unspoken rules, we're all about on the same page. And then I realized that was not the case. That's something that I was so excited about doing, and that I thought everyone was excited about it as well, was the nightmare to other people to actually have to do those things. It was like, okay, we're all very different indeed. So yeah, the earlier we learn about those things and can be empathetic with those differences, definitely helps a lot. Nice. Well, so my next question perhaps it can even be somewhat connected to this answer, which is, what are some traits or skills that you've identified in successful professionals throughout your career?
Academia, to a certain extent, and I don't know if you agree to this, but it's a little bit of a self-imposed prison. It can completely consume you. The people that I feel are the most successful, not with the most publications, but the ones that I think are the most successful, that have found a way to balance this monster with, and stay sane and have healthy relationships. I was I've been to more than one retirement now, and it's sad when a, a major professor that you looked up to has to apologize to his wife because he was never there. And he does that during his retirement. In a way, that's a very sad statement. For myself, that only came because I started running. 10 years ago, I started running, and that in many ways has been a savior for me. So now I run marathons. I traded one workaholic for, to something else.
Yeah. No, that's it's I totally agree, and it's really refreshing to hear a senior professor saying that. I feel like a lot of times the newer generation is thinking more about this balance and making sure that we are not overworking, overcommitting, which is really easy in academia because we are the CEOs of our startup, right? So as you get from it, as the more time you put into it, the more probably you get out of it. So I've heard these comments, this mindset a lot more from, I guess, younger, newer generation assistant professors, and it's really refreshing to hear that from an established professor already, and that also shares that mindset. So that's really, really interesting. Thanks for sharing that.
Now there is a penalty to that. I don't publish as much as I should, but it's a conscious choice.
It's trade-offs, right? It's all about trade-offs and how we navigate them. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that. And well, all these, I really enjoyed our conversation. I learned a lot, both on the technical side, but also on the personal side. Here, you shared some very, very interesting comments for these resources, and also, just this overall mindset is something I really appreciated you sharing with us as well. So, Jochum, I think that's coming to a wrap on our episode. Thank you again for being with us here today. I greatly enjoyed our conversation. I'm sure our audience did or will, as well as they will hear this in the future. And again, just want to thank you for your time and being here with us today. It was awesome.
Thank you for the opportunity.